All right, welcome everybody. This is going to be a YouTube video just going back over the presentation that I gave at Research Education in Vancouver at Mulgrave School. Of course, if you want to get a hold of me for any reason, you can get me on Twitter at BrianPenfound, or if you want to send me an email, it's brian.penfound@gmail.com. So today we're going to talk a little bit about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and looking at some of the literature that I found as I was searching with regards to cognitive load theory. So a couple things that we will discuss in this particular presentation is first we're just going to get a groundwork for what ADHD is as it's diagnosed by the DSM. So typically the DSM would give us 9 or 10 points to look for in our patients, and if they have several of those points, then they could get this classification of ADHD. After we have a basis of what the diagnoses look like for ADHD, we're going to get a little look at cognitive load theory. So I want to explain the basis of long-term and working memory, especially with regards to extraneous and intrinsic loads. As we work through discussion about extraneous and intrinsic load, we will talk a little bit about some of the important effects that are emerging out of the framework. And it's these important effects that are kind of beneficial for us to keep in mind as educators. After we have a little bit of basis in cognitive load theory, we're going to kind of flip back into ADHD. And some of the studies that I was reading dealt with the following topics. One in particular with sexual dimorphism of ADHD. One about learning how to give rewards for those individuals with ADHD, and a little rabbit hole that I kind of stumbled upon called Perceptual Load by Nili Lavie. And I'm going to look at how we can connect that to cognitive load, the cognitive load framework that we talk about in part 2. Finally, at the end, I'll give some potential tips for classroom teachers. So let's begin with looking at what ADHD is and how it's diagnosed via the DSM. So here what we have is a little chart that I grabbed from the Center of Disease Control and Prevention from the United States. Now this particular chart, I'm really looking at kind of these bars over here, and I'm looking at kind of all of the diagnosed cases of ADHD. And in blue we have boys, and in it looks like orange or pink here we have the girls. So between 2004 and 2006, what we're really seeing is that boys tend to get diagnosed about 2 to 3 times more than girls do, which is kind of interesting. And in fact, it's usually that 12 to 17 age group that's the most likely where we see the diagnoses occur. Of course, with regards to Canada, the most prevalent psychiatric disorder, and about 5 in every 100 children, I would say, worldwide do end up getting diagnosed with ADHD. One of the current working frameworks we have for reasoning for where ADHD comes from is an underdevelopment in the frontal lobe. And what happens here is, since the frontal lobe, especially in the prefrontal cortex, since it deals with a lot of executive functioning, we see a lot of deficits in these particular executive functions. So things like attentional control, or cognitive inhibition, or inhibitory control, working memory, cognitive flexibility, and even higher order executive functions like fluid intelligence or problem solving and reasoning. So a lot of deficits happening in these particular areas. And in a lot of the literature that I read, the deficit in working memory was considered a core deficit. So the diagram that I have here of the prefrontal cortex, I'm just showing you a couple of different regions and what we theorize those regions of the brain control. So why might we care about those individuals with ADHD? Of course, as educators, we know that these individuals do have difficulties learning, and this does lead typically to lowered academic success. Of interest is that we also typically tend to see many ADHD individuals with lowered self-esteem. Now, this may come from the lowered academic success, because we know that lowered academic success tends to lead to lowered self-esteem, and then you kind of get stuck in this cycle. The lowered self-esteem may also come from, especially students that are inside of a classroom, their peer group's not really understanding how they're acting. So a couple different reasons why we might see lowered self-esteem. And this lowered self-esteem leads to a couple other things, such as potential mental health issues for these individuals, and sometimes even substance abuse. Individuals with ADHD also tend to have a higher chance of sustaining injuries, including accidents. For example, one of the ADHD students that I have had in one of my classes, in the first week of classes, decided that it would be a great idea to wave to his friend as he was driving through a busy intersection. And of course, we're driving a car, so it's helpful to have two hands on the wheel, and ended up hitting the vehicle in front of him. So typically it's that kind of impulsivity that leads to these injuries or accidents. Okay, let's go ahead and try to work through the DSM a little bit to get a clearer idea of the different types of ADHD. The first type I want to talk about is inattentive type ADHD. A couple of items inside the DSM for these individuals are things like losing items easily, getting easily distracted by external stimuli, and being very forgetful in daily activities. The same individual I was talking about with regards to the car accident. Great story. I was sitting with one of my colleagues from biology, and he came over really excited about some things that he wanted to hang up into the classroom, but he had to go get them cut at the library. So he left his laptop on the table with Sharon and I, and Sharon just looked at me and as he ran off to the library and said, is he going to come back for that? And I said, no, he's definitely not going to come back for that. And sure enough, when he was done at the library, he came back, grabbed his backpack, packed everything up, grabbed his laptop case, and went up to the next class that he had, just kind of oblivious to the fact that he had left his laptop behind on the table. So I ended up taking a picture and sending it to him saying, hey, did you forget something at the table? And then he ran back down and grabbed it a few minutes later. So this is kind of that classic kind of being forgetful about these everyday items that I'm trying to get across. Other signs of individuals with inattentive type ADHD is this inability to pay close attention to details. This could stem from being forgetful or stem from this inability to be really focused in paying attention to those details. So part and parcel with this inability to pay close attention comes this inability to organize tasks or activities. And potentially due to the core deficit in working memory, we often see these individuals trying to avoid tasks that require sustained mental effort. Finally, last couple signs of individuals with inattentive type ADHD is this inability to stay focused, like we were talking about. And because they can't really stay focused, it appears like they're not really listening when they're being spoken directly to. And if they're unable to listen and stay focused to what we're saying, then of course it's also hard for them to follow through on instructions afterwards. So I have this picture here. This is kind of the classic picture that I think of with inattentive type ADHD, of this individual kind of staring off into their own little world, not paying attention to the task at hand. Next, let's contrast that with the impulsive type ADHD. For impulsive type, we have individuals that like to talk excessively and really butt in and try to kind of take over the conversation. So they're the ones where you're asking a question and without even thinking, they're just blurting out the answer to the question. Or you're having a conversation with people and they're butting in and trying to say something. It may or may not even be anything related to the conversation that you're having at hand. Of interest is when I've talked to people with ADHD, a lot of this kind of blurting and butting in really is because there's so much happening at once in their working memory that they're kind of afraid that they're going to lose that information. So they kind of blurt it out right away so that they know that you're going to listen to it and they're not going to forget that item that's happening in the background. Of course, impulsive types, these are the individuals we often think of as on the go and are running and getting up when it may not be appropriate to do so. Individuals with impulsive type ADHD may have fidgets or tics, and of course they tend to have trouble playing quietly and difficulty waiting their turn, as we were talking about. Of course, if you have the best of both worlds, we could say that it is a combined type ADHD. These individuals do have many of the traits of both impulsive and inattentive type ADHD. So I'm a math teacher by trade, and ADHD was something that wasn't really on my radar until I started sitting down and talking a little bit more with one of my calculus students this semester, and his name is Oakley. And we were talking a little bit about how he got diagnosed with ADHD and how that makes him feel. And this particular quote came out. And I thought to myself, this is really interesting because it's so true of ADHD students in general, that it's not that they can't focus their attention on something. When they focus their attention on something, they're actually quite good at keeping on task and on focus. It's really just a matter of trying to figure out how to get their claws into the item that you want them to think about. So that discussion with Oakley really stemmed some curiosity in me, and I wanted to see what cognitive load theory had to say, if it had anything to say, about individuals with ADHD. Now, to be able to interpret some of the findings that I did dig up, we need to know a little bit about how cognitive load theory is framed. So I want to talk a bit about the long-term memory store and the working memory space, and try to give you a little bit of a framework of how that works. Once we have that basis, we can talk a little bit about intrinsic and extraneous loads. And then along the way, we'll talk a little bit about cognitive load effects and potential learning strategies and how that alters the particular diagrams that we're working with. In the simplest sense, we have two key players in the framework. We have an area in our brain that we call the long-term memory store. We currently theorize that this space is fairly infinite in size. Think of it like a long hallway with many lockers, and inside the lockers you can kind of hang all of the pieces of information that you'd like to retrieve at any given time later in your life. Now, of course, sometimes it gets really hard to find these lockers or find the information within the locker, but hopefully that gives you an analogy to at least think about with regards to the long-term memory store. We also have this processing space called the working memory. Now, we kind of theorize currently that the working memory has a limited capacity, so I'm going to use these 5 white circles to represent that limited capacity. Now, that's not to say that the working memory can only hold 5 pieces of information. This is just to help us with the analogy of processing space. And typically what happens is we have some information coming in from the environment, and this can be what we call task-relevant stimuli, so the things that we want our students to think about. Or it could be other stimuli. It could be, hey, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? Do I have to pick the children up from school? Is it raining outside? So there's lots of things coming in from the environment that we are consciously and subconsciously processing in our working memory space. Of course, if we want to process some items in our working memory, we may want to draw on information from our long-term memory as well. So our working memory has the capacity to go into our long-term memory store and pull information out into the working memory so that we can process the external stimuli and the internal stimuli together. So right now, with the 2 black X's and 2 orange X's, we have a nice balance of stimuli. Our working memory has a little bit of spare capacity that you can see up here, signified by this white circle. A little bit of spare capacity to allow it to do some processing. As we start to process information, that information gets passed into the long-term memory store and can potentially get encoded. Now, I'd like for you to imagine that there's a lot of external stimuli right now being passed into our working memory space. If that's the case, and we are trying to draw some information from our long-term memory store, notice how quickly our working memory can get overloaded. There's no free capacity in our working memory now to enable it to process any of this information. And so we see a decrease in the ability of our working memory to pass information to our long-term memory store. In terms of cognitive load theory, we may say that the working memory has become overloaded, or that the individual experiencing this is in cognitive overload. Overload doesn't necessarily have to happen only from the environmental side. Think about a really complex problem that maybe you've tried to solve, and think about all of the items that you had to go and draw in from your long-term memory store. If I want to synthesize all that information that I'm drawing on with external stimuli, so task-relevant stimuli, again, this can become very overwhelming. So it is possible for cognitive overload to happen on the other side as well. So drawing too much information into my long-term memory, and then I kind of forget about what's going on with the question in the first place. And again, this makes that processing capacity of the working memory very limited. It's really hard to move information from our working memory storage space into our long-term memory storage space. So, in my opinion, one of the goals of education for me, as I'm thinking about my lessons, is how can I prevent working memory overload with my students? In other words, I want my picture to look something like this. I want my students to have at least a little bit of spare capacity in order to process both the task-relevant stimuli that I'm giving to them from the environment, as well as what they already know and are drawing on from their long-term memory store. So one thing that we can do as educators is to try to decrease what we call extraneous load. Extraneous load deals with kind of how we frame the problem. So it could be things like what style of teaching pedagogy we use, or how my slides look inside of my presentation, or how I explain the problem. If I'm able to decrease the extraneous load, then we have a bit more capacity up here now for my students to synthesize this information. Now, there's a lot of beautiful effects that have come out of the cognitive load theory literature that are worth talking about here. The goal-free effect is one really interesting effect, where it states that sometimes it's better to frame the problem in terms of kind of this open-ended problem, but very focused on the technique that I want my students to use. So, for example, instead of drawing a large diagram with many angles that I want my students to find and asking them to find a particular one, I just ask this kind of goal-free question of find as many angles as you can in this given diagram. The worked example effect tends to deal more with novice learners in the sense that they really appreciate having some kind of what we call a worked example, so a solved example or a partially solved example that they can focus their attention on. And giving them this kind of scaffolding allows them either to complete the partially completed problem or to use that as a framework to start a new problem. The split attention effect has to deal with how we set up diagrams and words together. So sometimes it's better to actually embed the words inside the diagram rather than have the diagram and the words split apart. And finally, the expertise reversal effect deals with the core knowledge that my learners actually have. So novice learners, or those learners that don't have as much information about the topic at hand in their long-term memory store, they learn best through practices like direct instruction and using lots of worked examples. Whereas a learner that has a lot of knowledge in the particular area that we're working with, they tend to work better by using things like inquiry learning or problem-based learning. Worked examples or direct instruction may actually lead to cognitive overload for our expert learners. One thing that's a little bit harder to deal with as an educator is intrinsic load. So this really boils down to how inherently challenging the problem is to that learner. And it's really hard for us to control it. Whereas I can control extraneous load a little bit more by thinking about how I'm teaching, the intrinsic load really boils down to something that we call element interactivity. So we're looking at how many things need to be processed inside the working memory space at once in order for my learner to really comprehend what's happening. And as the amount of interacting elements increases, the working memory capacity tends to increase as well. One last thing that I do want to mention here is thinking about using what I would call an effective learning strategy. So things like interleaving my practice, so not giving a bunch of blocked examples all the time, but kind of mixing up the different style of questions. So maybe giving like some addition problems with some multiplication problems with some subtraction problems. This would be an idea of interleaved practice. There's also this really important idea of space practice. So I don't want to do all of my practice right after I've learned the material. I actually want to try to forget about that material a little bit and then try to do some practice. And then try to forget that material a little bit again and then practice again. So we want to really space our practice out, and this really strengthens the chains that we're forming inside the long-term memory store. And of course, I can't talk enough about the testing effect. So yes, testing is great. As long as you're using like not necessarily a high stakes test, if you're using testing in order for your students to learn, this can be of really great benefit for them because testing naturally uses interleaved and spaced practice already. So by utilizing these effective learning strategies, we're strengthening some of the bonds that we're forming in the long-term memory store. And then what happens when our working memory dives into the long-term memory store to grab that information is it can actually pull it out as a big chain. So I can pull out, instead of these isolated facts, I can actually pull them all out. And inside cognitive load theory, we call this a schema. So we can start pulling out partial schemas or even full schemas, and we're going to look at taking up less space inside of our working memory now, which again leaves us with a bit more processing space up here, and this greater ability to synthesize new information. All right, now that we've talked a little bit about what the kind of fundamental structure of cognitive load theory looks like, let's go ahead and dive into some of the research I started unearthing with regards to ADHD. A lot of the studies that I read had this idea of a go, no-go task. So I did want to explain that really briefly here. Typically, a go, no-go task is divided into a low working memory load situation and a high working memory load situation. Individuals are asked to sit down, say in front of a computer, and they're asked to press a certain button if they see a green spaceship. So in our case, they're pressing the space bar if they see a green spaceship, and they're asked not to press the space bar if they see a red spaceship. Since this is a very simplistic case, researchers called this a low working memory load scenario. Let's contrast this with the high working memory load scenario, where once again we ask our participants to press space if they see a green spaceship, but we kind of up the ante with the red spaceship. So essentially what's happening here is this introduction of this more complex structure with the red spaceship is really increasing the cognitive demand of our participants. And that's why we call this the high working memory load scenario. So in this particular study by Seymour and compadres, they did a standard go, no-go task and measured a couple of things. So here they had the simple versus complex. You can see here down along our x-axis, and along the y-axis they have two measurements, one called commission error rate and one called tau. And what these two measurements are giving us is some kind of indication into the response control of the participants in our study. And we had about 50 individuals in each group. We had about 50 typically developing girls and typically developing boys, as well as 50 girls and boys, 50 ADHD girls and 50 ADHD boys. And a couple of things of interest here. So you can see that when we're looking at the simple go, no-go task for the girls, there really isn't a significant difference between the two groups here, the control versus the ADHD group, because we can see that those standard error bars have quite a significant overlap. However, once we move into the complex go, no-go task, there is a significant difference for the girls. So this kind of key difference between the girls, we really can't tell the difference between the groups in a simple task, but as soon as their working memory gets overloaded, then the response control of those ADHD girls becomes a little inhibited, which is really interesting. The other thing that's kind of interesting to notice here is, of course, all of the boy groups, whether it was a simple go, no-go or a complex go, no-go, showed distinct differences between the groups. So even when the working memory capacity was low, we still saw a lack of response control in the ADHD boys. And this could be why it's challenging for us to diagnose ADHD girls, because we don't really see the lack of response inhibition coming out until their working memory capacity is under significant stress. Another common experiment to see is a delayed discounting experiment. And typically what we're doing in this kind of framework is we're offering some kind of reward now, but a little bit more of that reward at a later time. And our participants have to choose which one they want. So we're kind of trying to measure at which point along a continuum the smaller, sooner reward is equivalent to the larger, later reward. In the classic delayed discounting, we typically use something like a monetary reward. In a couple of the studies that I did look at, they used a real-time delayed discounting reward, in which case the participants had that same framework of they got a little bit of something now and a lot more of that same something later, but the researchers used a video game or something that was really desirable for the individuals or the participants. And to give you kind of an idea of how delayed discounting may affect those individuals with ADHD, I'm going to toss up a linear regression here that Martinelli and friends did, where along the x-axis they measured the cognitive load, and along the y-axis they measured the real-time discounting. And what's important to notice here is that as the real-time discounting, as this value goes down, what this means is that individual is showing less impulsivity or more self-control. Now, our control group here is shown as the white dots. And you can see they're fairly scattered, and the correlation coefficient we're getting is not particularly strong. So it really doesn't matter the amount of cognitive load that these individuals are under. Their impulsivity is kind of all over the map. However, for the ADHD individuals, which are measured in black, you can see that there's like this tendency, there's this really strong clump down here that kind of draws the correlation down towards it a little bit, that linear regression line. So we see a pretty strong correlation coefficient of negative 0.5, and telling us that as cognitive load increases, the impulsivity decreases, or we see more self-control. And this was only true for the real-time discounting task. This wasn't true for the classic delayed discounting task. So this gives us some indication of when we may want to discuss rewards with our ADHD students. So I do want to reward them anyway if they've done a complex task, but this might also be a good time after their working memory has been a little bit at capacity to discuss a future reward for good work. And you want to be specific here. You want it to be a real-time reward. You want it to be an immediately consumable reward, something that's of high value to them. Next up, I want to dive a little bit down a rabbit hole that I managed to unearth while I was looking at some of the ADHD literature. And this is Lavy's load theory of attention. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start with our typical cognitive load theory architecture. And we're going to add one more component in here. We're going to add the sensory memory. The sensory memory is essentially going to be a place where our environmental stimuli enter, and the sensory memory is going to somehow pick and choose the stimuli that we're going to focus our attention on and pass off to the working memory. Now, Lavie theorizes that the sensory memory also has some kind of limited capacity. So once again, I'm going to use these 5 white circles here just to denote that the sensory memory has some kind of natural capacity in this theory. And what you could imagine is if we had some external stimuli. Here I'm going to use the black X's to represent the task-relevant stimuli and the capital D's to represent distractor stimuli. You could imagine that if the task-relevant stimuli don't capture all of the perceptual load, then now there's a little bit of space in the sensory memory for distractor processing. And what happens is maybe those distractors now get passed into the working memory space. And as we know, with students that have ADHD, as soon as they have a distractor in their working memory, it is no bueno, it's game over, you're done. On the flip side, Lavie theorizes that if the task-relevant stimuli capture all of the perceptual load, then there's really no spare capacity to process the distractors, in which case all of the task-relevant stimuli get passed off to the working memory space. And here's a quote from Lavie from one of her preliminary papers in the 90s that I think captures this essence really well. So one question you might have is, what's the difference between low perceptual load and high perceptual load? What does that even look like? So I want to just go through a couple of scenarios that I did see as I was reading the literature. A lot of the literature involved these kind of tasks that look like this. The participant was looking for either the letter X or the letter N, and they had to press that corresponding button on, let's say, a keyboard. And in this case, under low perceptual load, the X was flanked or surrounded by a lot of letters that were not really visually similar to the letter X. So we had all these like really rounded letters. SpongeBob here represents the distractor. And so in Lavie's load theory of attention, in this case, in the low perceptual load case, is it's very easy for us to see the task-relevant stimuli of X, so we spend a little bit more time processing the distractor than normal. That's what the theory would suggest. If we contrast this to the high perceptual load case, when I go searching for that X, because it's now flanked by a bunch of kind of visually similar letters, it's a little bit harder for us to find that task-relevant stimuli. It takes a little bit longer for us to get there. It takes up more of our perceptual load. So we're less likely to focus on the distractor of SpongeBob here because that perceptual load is full. And so these studies have been replicated in the literature. And I wanted to share one particular study that was relevant to those with ADHD, and that was by Forster and friends. And so in here we have the two groups. We have the ADHD group and the control group. And we have in the light gray, we have the low perceptual load case. And in the dark gray, we have the high perceptual load case. And what we're measuring here over on the side is just the reaction time in milliseconds. So we're trying to get a gauge on how many milliseconds we're actually processing that distractor. So two things to notice. If I look at the difference between the gray bars, so between the control group and the ADHD group, typically the ADHD group is about twice as likely or takes about twice as long, I would say, to process the distractor under normal circumstances, under a low perceptual load. And if we compare kind of just the ADHD group, the difference between the light gray bar and the dark gray bar, as I increase the perceptual load, the time that it takes me to process that distractor comes way down. So in other words, I spend less time on that distractor in the case when there's a high perceptual load. And this is true of the control group as well. So to finish off the discussion here, I want just to give some tips for teachers or some things to think about inside of your classroom with regards to your ADHD students. So of course, one of the most important things you can do is never reward their negative behavior. So it's really all about framing. What you want to do is you want to reward them when they've done something really great, when you're really happy with the behavior that they're showing you. If you are going to make some reward charts, that's a great idea. Make sure that the rewards that you're going to give them are these immediately consumable rewards. You want to give them something that they really value. And remember too that if they've undergone some time where they've really used their working memory capacity, that's a good time to potentially engage in that conversation of a bigger future reward for more good behavior. Okay, for those students that may be inattentive type, it may be helpful for them to have a study buddy. So somebody who will help them not forget their laptop in the cafeteria, for example. If you think your students have the capacity to do so, assign them duties that do require them to use a little bit of that self-control that they're trying to develop. And when they do that successfully, make sure that you reward them. When it comes to managing the classroom, some really great things to do are to create these routines. So not just a routine for transition, like when I'm moving from my classroom to the gym or to the library, you also want a routine for your classroom instructions. Think about how challenging it is for students when they enter the classroom and one day you're doing this, and the next day you're doing this, and on the next day you're doing this. For those students with ADHD, that's really challenging. So one place that I kind of recommend to go to is to New Visions. And if you're on Twitter, you can follow David Wees. And he has some beautiful classroom routines that are kind of designed with this cognitive load theory in mind. The idea is as the students get more experience with these routines, it becomes more and more routinized and decreases their working memory capacity. Now, one of the biggest things that I can tell new teachers is you want, look at how beautiful this picture looks. This is like my ideal classroom. There are no distractions on the walls. So think about what Lavy's theory says. If there are distractors present and we don't have high perceptual load, then those distractors now vie for attention, right? And they start leaking into our working memory space. So if I can eliminate some of those visual stimuli or some of those excessive noises that typically happen in an everyday classroom, that's really going to help your ADHD students. One thing that I found particularly helpful with my ADHD students is to just allow them to come up to the board and solve the problems at the board. When they're focused and looking at the board, then they don't have those visual stimuli, those visual distracting stimuli, because everything's happening behind them now. Okay, tying into what we were talking about with routines, it's if you do want to post some stuff around the walls, you may want to post your rules or you may want to post your schedules so that students can easily follow these. Looking at a big assignment can sometimes feel really daunting and take up a lot of working memory capacity, especially if it's making students anxious. So one thing you can kind of think about is whether or not you want to present your bigger assignments in pieces, or whether choice might be a good idea on your assessments as well. Never a bad idea to allow your students a little bit of extra time to work through assessments if needed, especially with those students with ADHD. I would say the students that I've worked with with ADHD typically tend, they'll give themselves a ballpark like, oh, this is going to take me about a half of an hour to do. And then, 4 hours later, they're finally done. So just kind of be mindful that sometimes it takes a little bit of extra processing time for them when we're working with assessments. Of course, when it comes to trying to help these students learn, I can't talk enough about the learning scientists. Look them up online. They have printable and accessible strategy guides for what they call the 6 effective learning strategies. So interleaved practice, spacing, dual coding, worked examples, elaboration, for example. So definitely look them up and take a peek at what they say about how to utilize those in the classroom. Of course, games like Kahoot are great for that kind of spaced and interleaved practice and kind of gives it a little bit of fun inside the classroom as well. Of course, you want to make sure that those students that do have ADHD, you don't allow ADHD to really overtake the person that they are, right? So for me, I always keep my expectations high, but I realize that sometimes they're going to need a little bit of extra time or a little bit of extra guidance to get where I want them to be. They're not going to get there necessarily right away. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. Helpful here to develop a good rapport, like they're still your students. They're still human beings that deserve your love and attention. And last but not least, it's really all about framing, right? So you can tell them if you're not pleased with some of their negative behavior, but you really want to reward that positive behavior. Let them know when they're doing really, really well. Most importantly, be consistent and be clear with them. That will go a long, long way. All right, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Of course, if you do have any questions, you can always hit me up on Twitter or send me an email at my Gmail account.